With the NES, there were some really good controllers, but there was also some really questionable controllers. So today I'm going to be counting down everything wrong with the NES MAX. This controller has a joystick. Its only purpose is to press the buttons. And if you don't like it and you decide to start using the D-pad, well, that's really hard to do because they're really far away from each other and it's almost inevitable to press the joystick. The A and B buttons are really uncomfortable on your thumbs, which is really unfortunate because they're like the biggest part of the whole thing. The shaping on this controller is really bad and really uncomfortable too. For modern controllers, this is a pretty normal shaping, but this thing is so small it just doesn't make sense. There are these little bumps where shoulder buttons should be, but instead it's just really uncomfortable on your hands when you're trying to play a video game. The select and start buttons are just unreasonably bad, and it's almost really inevitable to try and press the select button without pressing this button on the D-pad. Oh, and don't even get me started on gameplay performance. Playing games on this thing is like a nightmare. Let's compare some gameplay of the NES MAX versus the NES controller. So let's start by playing with the NES MAX. Are you ready? Let's go. How to use the menu. Here we are. Okay. So I'm using the joystick right now, and you have to push really, and I died immediately. Now let's try it with the original. I'm playing as Luigi. Okay, nice. Oh, and I killed the first Goomba. Okay. It's pretty good. Mushroom. Let's keep going. I made it significantly further than I did with the NES MAX. Now let's use the secret warp zone down here. So I made it significantly further with the original NES controller. But that's not all I'm going to be comparing today, while I count down all the flaws of the NES MAX. So I think we should move to the next section of flaw counting. I'm going to be comparing this comfort-wise to the other NES controllers now. So as I stated, it's really uncomfortable to use while playing video games. There's a lot of flaws that I didn't touch on, including when you try to press the A button, you might accidentally press the turbo button. This same thing happens with the B button. The select and start buttons are uncomfortable and hard to reach, which is a +2 on its flaw count, and it's just overall really uncomfortable to hold, especially because of these unneeded prongs. The original NES controller is pretty comfortable to hold and has not very many major flaws. If there was one major flaw that I would point out, I guess it would be it's a little blocky and get a little uncomfortable after a while, but nobody plays Nintendo games for hours on end. Unless you're trying to beat Super Mario, which in that case, this might be a reasonable problem. The dog bone is probably the most comfortable NES controller ever, and it only has really one major flaw, and that's that these buttons are a little weird because they're rubbery, while the others are just normal and plastic. As you can see in a comparison, these are a little rubbery, and while these are made of plastic. That's my only complaint about the dog bone, but other than that, it's basically a SNES controller for the NES. Now I'm going to compare it look-wise to the other NES controllers. And this thing doesn't look like an NES controller. Let's compare it to a regular NES controller. Here, look, the NES controller looks pretty recognizable and looks like a video game controller. This thing looks like it came straight out of Spy Kids, which I can say I just revisited, and I'm questioning why I liked it as a little kid. The NES controller looks more classy, and it's better and looks more like a video game controller. It's more appropriate for a Nintendo console, and it's overall probably one of the greatest console controllers ever made. And the dog bone looks like a SNES controller, but even more, well, it looks like a dog bone. That's pretty obvious. It's even in its name, dog bone controller. In the end, the NES Max got a whopping 14 flaw points, which is really bad. But let's subtract some flaw points by looking at the good parts of this NES Max. The turbo buttons are really useful for when you want a quick fire, and I have to say, they're pretty good. The Max has some grips along the side that help you grab the controller, and it's pretty good for gameplay. The font on this thing is pretty cool and adds a nice addition to the controller. So, subtracting 3 flaw points, its final score is 11 points. So, moral of the story, it's not the Power Glove, but it's up there.